reading the well known writer and journalist Amrita Shah's latest book is a highly kinetic experience. The book, titled The Other Mohan in Britain's Indian Ocean Empire, a personal journey into history, has a great deal of rapid movements of Indians and Europeans, of goods and services, of ideas and counter ideas. As the book's blurb describes it, it is about the movements of traders, indentured workers, interpreters, soldiers, slaves, prostitutes, lashkars, and smugglers. A clash between the needs of white settlers and the aspirations of Indian migrants in South Africa saw the emergence of Gandhi's Satyagraha campaign. It is a book bookended by two Mohans. One was, of course, Mohandas Gandhi, and the other, Mohanlal Killawala. It is Mohanlal Killawala whose life in South Africa, contemporaneously with Gandhi in the early 1900s, that Amrita uses as the central focus to tell a much larger story because he happens to be her great grandfather from her mother's side. Killawala, who sailed to South Africa in search of professional opportunities as an interpreter, ended up being someone not just with a first hand view of the nascent days of Gandhi's Satyagraha, but even a participant in it who inevitably met him. It is an extraordinarily researched book which has the distinction of being superbly written that took Amrita 10 years. She spoke to MCR from Mumbai.
Welcome to Mayank Chhaya Reports, Amrita. It's an absolute pleasure to see you.
It's lovely to see you, Mayank, after all this time.
It's been a very long time, yes. And my compliments on a dauntingly detailed but also superbly written book.
Thank you so much.
That's a tough balance to strike, something which is this detailed and something which is this readable.
Yeah.
How did you manage to do that? In the sense, because there's so much research has gone into it. I have read most of it. It's 432 pages. And then
I know. I apologize.
yeah,
I mean, it is, you're right. It is, the more detail you have makes for good writing in one sense, because you have a lot of material with which to build atmosphere and, kind of create the setting and things like that. But it's also difficult because what happened was that I set out not knowing, what I was going to find. It was really a sort of jaunt, you can say, just a kind of. I was just taking a chance, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it, and then I found so much in the archives, and then I found so much more. And in fact, the more I found, I began to get seriously worried because my aim was to write a kind of literary book, not a deeply scholarly book. That was not my intention. I set out to solve this little family mystery. That what was my great grandfather doing on this journey, and who my great grandmother was. It was a sort of personal quest, and I thought it might even be a novel. Once get going, and in fact, the more material I found, the more scared I got because the danger was that it would become a very niche kind of book that would have, because there was what I was finding out is very sort of original material. These were original findings that had not been, not been talked about, or except very, very, very kind of limited way by a couple of scholars in South Africa. And what I was finding was actually a link to the Gandhi story, between the Gandhi story and their findings. And so it was very new. And I said, how am I going to explain this? Who's going to be interested? Who's going to be following me here except very, scholars of this era or of the British Empire? It would be a very limited book. And I'm not an academic, so this was not my aim. But so, which is why actually it took a really long time for me to write this book, because I was determined to fuse the two, to keep its historical value and its literary value. And for that, I think what took a long time was that I had to live the detail. I mean, I had to enter that space, that time, understand, because there were lots of names of people who I'm quoting. I'm not quoting, but I'm kind of, that world is made up of all these many people and these many communities, and I didn't want to give information. I wanted to narrate it as if one was actually bringing making that space come to life. This idea of these pioneering migrants, people who went outside India at that early time, and what their lives were, and how they built a kind of new life in this, this new space, and the complexity of that life. We tend to think we only know of Gandhi going abroad in this period.
Right.
I mean, we talk about the diaspora a bit, but and so my story was much larger. It was about an ordinary migrant, and as I said, I wanted to. Um, I thought it was a very, how to say, kind of it was, I was so interested in it. It interested me so much to know how they set up home, how they made their lives, who was what, and who was related to what, and so it took me quite a long time. It took
Right.
me, the whole book took 10 years to write, and the research, really, I struck very lucky very early. So I think that was, the kind of, I was very lucky that that happened so easily, I would say. But making sense of it,
Right.
tying it up with the background, and as I said, inhabiting that space so that I'm not giving you chunks of information, but I'm actually telling a story. I had to kind of live with that material, kind of read it over and over and over again, try and understand it in new and different ways. That took a long time, and I think time was the way I sort of solved that.
I'm so glad you mentioned two things, that you were perhaps prompted to take sort of a literary approach like a novel early on, given the kind of information you had. That was my very next question. You have this imaginary Khalasi bit in your book. You talk about a seafarer or a Khalasi, as
Yes,
they're called.
yeah, the Khalasi, yeah,
When I was reading it read to me like a sort of a cross between Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness
yeah.
and, surprisingly, Gunmantraya Acharya's Daryalal. I don't know if you've read the great.
No, I haven't.
Oh,
Okay.
it's one of perhaps my favorite Gujarati novel. It
Oh, I'd love
talks
to.
about precisely the slave trade, Gujarati paddies in Africa. It's a fantastic book.
Give me the name again.
Daryalal.
Daryanath. No, I have not read it. I
You
must.
must get your
I
hands on
must.
it.
Yeah.
It's I mean, to me, it's the best Gujarati novel of its kind. So anyway, so when I read
Fantastic.
it,
Yeah.
I was swinging between the two, and I said, "Why doesn't Amrita continue writing that part? Forget Mohanlal for a while." So,
Yes, no, I
were you
get it.
tempted to do that?
There are some. What happened was, many unexpected things happened when as I said, I started out with this idea that I had this great grandfather who went on an unexplained journey. And it always fascinated me. From the time I was a child, I was fascinated by the idea that I had an ancestor who was adventurous. I like that. And this mystery of my great grandmother. So when I set out, right, that was what prompted me. I did not expect many things that happened to happen. One of which was that, so my great grandfather the family came from Surat,
Hmm.
this part of the family. And I did not actually even know that. I had never even been to Surat. I'd gone past, I passed through it very often. And I think I might have gone on a journalistic trip for a day or something. But I don't remember actually experiencing Surat. And so when I started reading up about it, and the fact, I knew it was a port, but how important a port, its place on the Indian Ocean trade, and then the Indian Ocean itself, the history of the ocean. I did not expect that to become part
Right.
of my sort of the atmosphere of this book at all. And so I kind of went on this sort of trip on the ocean, which is what you refer to, the Khalasi, and finding this character of this seafarer who comes from, the Arabian coast to and settles down on the western coast in India, in Gujarat. Um, but I there are so many good books written on the Indian Ocean. Um, Scholars who write about the Indian Ocean kind of, I think, respond to the romance of the ocean. And so I think that there's no way I could undertake that job, which has already been done by scholars like Michael Pearson and various others whose books are so evocative. So I think I must not take credit entirely for the Khalasi's the character.
No, but I'm talking purely in terms of the writing part of it. It's
Yeah.
yeah, but it also seems to me that on this quest of yours for your maternal grandfather, Mohanlal Killawala,
Yeah.
you ended up quickly exploring much broader history, say, of colonization quickly, versions of slavery and indentured labor and so on. Was that tough in the sense for you to bring it down from a bigger backdrop to a
Mhm.
single individual and his wife? How was that as a challenge as a writer?
Thing is, you see, I had this interest in, as I said, this ancestral history. But I think, that, as I said, from childhood, I had this idea that someday maybe, and then one becomes a researcher and realizes that you can actually, there are ways of investigating this,
Right,
come to kind of, because I met with academics and I started understanding that there are archives and things like that which you can explore. Because as a journalist, one is not, I at least wasn't that familiar with the world of historians. So, but I think when I started researching this, when I was much older, obviously this was around the early 2000s that I started thinking about it, because I think it was because I was already doing some reading on Gandhi, and
right,
suddenly South Africa became more real to me. That I started seeing it, what it would have been at that time, how large the community might have been. I started getting a sense, a realistic sense. It wasn't just I had this great grandfather who went. It wasn't. And so I think somewhere there was an idea that my story was not of interest only to me, because after all, I mean, we all have ancestors and we all have stories in our families, and it can be interesting, but
right.
it is not always interesting to a wider audience. And I'm not saying I set out, I just felt like that it was worth exploring to kind of satisfy my curiosity, of course, and my family's, but also because I felt that it tied up with something larger. I don't know. I had a certain instinct about it that there was a larger story here, that it was not just the story. And I do think, though, that individual stories are very
Right.
interesting to tell on their own. I'm not saying that they can't be told. But here I felt, because of the Gandhi connection, I mean, in the sense that that there was an idea, because the timing was the same, the similarities between the two men, both were, and Gandhi, we always think of dressed in a loincloth and very simple and, and a sort of ascetic life. And